afternoon. Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Susan Kelly, past president of the City Club. Welcome to the City Club and a very exciting program featuring Bill Gates Sr., co-chair of the world's largest charitable foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Mr. Gates will share with us his views on congressional efforts to repeal the federal estate tax. And this podium has been set up for Mr. Gates, and so I'm sorry if I'm peeking over a little bit. I have a few announcements. One is that our new director of City Club, Wendy Rodmacher-Willis, is hosting her parents today, Fred and Tanya from Eugene. Welcome. And if any of you have not introduced yourselves to Wendy, please do. And she'll be happy to get to know every one of the City Club members and all the guests that are here today that might consider joining City Club. Next week, join us to hear an update on proposed reforms to the Oregon Health Plan. Our speakers will be State Representative Alan Bates from Ashland, State Representative Jeff Cruz from Roseburg, and Director of the State Department of Human Services, Jean Thorne. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by the corporate sponsors Wells Fargo, Legacy Health System, and Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation. Bill Gates Sr. brings a distinguished career in law and many years of public service to his role as co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the world's largest foundation with an endowment of $24 billion granted by Mr. Gates' son, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, and his wife Melinda. The foundation focuses its giving in 4 areas: global health, education reform in the U.S., providing access to the internet and technology through our nation's libraries, and giving that supports children and families in the Northwest. The foundation is perhaps best known for its commitment to improving people's lives by sharing advances in medicine and health care with the global community. Since the foundation's beginning, more than $2.5 billion has been granted to combat infectious diseases, vaccine research and development, reproductive and child health, and HIV, AIDS in the developing world. Mr. Gates earned his bachelor's degree and law degree from the University of Washington and was a co-founder of Preston Gates, a branch of which, of course, you know is here in Portland. He is known as a champion for causes that have ranged from protecting affirmative action to providing legal services to the poor to funding law school scholarships for students of color. Mr. Gates has been a lifetime advocate for education, chairing the Seattle Public Schools Levy campaign in 1971 and serving as a member of the University of Washington's Board of Regents since 1997. Today, there are copies of Mr. Gates' book in the back of the room. The proceeds of the sale go to furthering the cause to support efforts to preserve the estate tax. I want to just, before we begin with our speaker, I want to read a brief quote in the book from Marion Wright Elderman, president of Children's Defense Fund. "Follow the money, and you find out what we truly care about as a nation. In a country where millions of children remain poor, hungry, homeless, uninsured, and poorly educated in the midst of unprecedented prosperity, Wealth in Our Commonwealth provides a thoughtful and much-needed perspective on how earlier generations of Americans have perceived the responsibility of wealth and the choices facing us now." With that, our guest speaker today, Bill Gates Sr.
Thank you very much, Susan, for those kind words. I know that if it weren't for my son, most of you wouldn't be here. But that's all right. It's an interesting thing to carry this name around. I have a youngest child, Libby, who was in a sporting goods store not long ago buying some ski equipment for her family, and when she finished the purchase, just handed her credit card to the clerk. He went over to the business desk and ran the thing through and came back to get her signature, and he had noticed that the middle name on the card was Gates, and so he, being a kind of an alert young man, looked at her and said, "Well, now, are you related to him?" And she was in a hurry that day, and she didn't have time for this conversation, so she said, well, no, I'm not. And he said, well, that's interesting. He said, you know, I didn't think so. You'd have bought better skis. Okay, so let's talk about taxes. We had an Internal Revenue Commissioner named Sheldon Cohen at one time. He wrote this, which I think is a good lead-in to this discussion. People think taxation is a terribly mundane subject, but what makes it fascinating is that taxation is reality. It's philosophy, it's life, and if you have the position a person takes on taxes, you can tell their whole philosophy. The tax code, once you get to know it, embodies all the essence of life, greed, politics, power, goodness, charity. Everything is in there. So let's start with greed, politics, and power. The movement to repeal the federal estate tax began about 10 years ago when some wealthy families got together to push along this effort, which had kind of existed sub rosa over a long, long period of time. And they pooled their resources and generated this campaign in earnest. And they have been sophisticated, they have been effective, and they have spent a lot of money. Without a hint of the dollar savings that repeal would mean to them, this high-powered public relations program has convinced the public at large and a majority of the Congress that the estate tax, they don't call it that, you know, it's the death tax, is something that shouldn't be imposed on people in this country, and they've created the sense in people's minds that it's imposed on everyone, and it makes it impossible to pass along your farm or your small business to your heirs. Well, in 2000, this very effective campaign got Congress to pass legislation to repeal the whole thing, even though President Clinton vowed that he would veto it when it came along. And to underscore that down on the farm image, which they were riding on, they sent the bill over to the White House in a big red tractor. Needless to say, that attracted a lot of attention and is consistent with the extremely effective job they've done selling this idea. And it, you know, provided a lot of good television. In August of 2000, President Clinton kept his word and he vetoed the repeal. He said, half the benefit of this bill that comes up here on that tractor goes to just 3,000 people, quipped the president, and he went on, I'll bet you not a single one of them ever drove a tractor. Representative Gephardt observed that if the proponents were being honest about the beneficiaries of their estate tax break, they would have had the bill delivered by Donald Trump in a stretch limousine. So where do we stand today? Well, again in 2001, the Congress tackled this problem, and they made a number of amendments to the then existing law. They set about to increase the exemptions so that in that very year, 01, the exemption went from $675,000 up to $1 million, and is on a schedule so that in 2009, the exemption will be $3.5 million per individual, which is $1 million for a couple. They also set about reducing the rates so that in 2009, the rate will be 45%. 45% on your net worth over $3.5 million. And of course, they sold it on the basis of the idea that people weren't able to keep their farms, and the family weren't able to keep their family businesses. And of course, that, as I say, that was pretty clever. Another way they might have done it, of course, would have been to have had one of their sons on a full-page ad in his Gucci's and his Armani suit, leaning on his Porsche and saying, "Come on now, we got to repeal this doggone tax. I'm not going to get the whole $100 million my daddy promised me. I might even have to go to work." So, incidentally, I'll toss in here a somewhat subsidiary but not unimportant fact that, among other things that the Congress did, the mechanics of that business in '01 when they passed this law was that they had to keep the impact below, along with the other things they were doing, below whatever the number was, 2-point-some trillion, something of that kind, over the period of the law. And in order to get within that number, they had to find other ways to save money. And one of the things that they did was to repeal the thing called the state tax credit. And it repeals over time. It's currently in place, I think, at 50% of its former rate. This was a neat, simple system where when people passed on, they paid their federal estate tax, sent a copy to the Department of Revenue in the state, and paid that state's tax, which was typically exactly the amount that the feds would permit. And it was all over, but just it was the simplest process in the world, very simple administration at the state level, and kind of an unnoticeable thing from the standpoint of the taxpayer. Now we're confronted with the fact that that's in the process of going away, and virtually as we speak, your friends in your state legislature are down there in Salem arguing about what to do about that situation, and it's complex and difficult. Anyway, what we do know is that the use of the family business and the family farm as the icons for repealing the tax have, led people to believe that that's what it's all about. And the cynicism of that is really revealed in a very dramatic way when you realize that half a dozen different times in the Congress there have been very insightful efforts made to change the tax on farms and family businesses. And it has never received a positive vote from any senator who wanted repeal. They knew perfectly well that those little changes weren't going to help their clients. They knew perfectly well that if they voted in those changes, there would not be repeal. So it's an illustration, unfortunately, of the enormous cynicism of the legislative process, that the very points being made to support significant legislative action involve problems that the legislators refuse to vote to solve for fear of the fact that their whole point in repealing the tax would go away. So here we are. We've got this 2001 tax which has these changes occurring, and then to finish that story, we have the really anomalous situation that after '09, when we get to the $3.5 million exemption and get down to the 45% rate, then because of the rules of the Senate, which don't permit a tax to be repealed for more than 10 years without a vote of 60 senators, they repealed the whole thing in 2010, and on January 1st, 2011, the whole estate tax array everything about it comes back into place exactly as it was in 2001. Now, that makes 2010 a very interesting year. There are columnists who have described it as the throw mama from the train year. It's an anomaly which we cannot live with, and really everybody knows that. If this country can't figure out a way to change this scenario, then we're in deep trouble. I mean, because that's a totally unacceptable, irresponsible scenario. So it's going to change some way. It's going to be changed. We're not going to have a tax repealed for 1 year and then come back into effect January 1st of the following year. Another little play on that is the large mansion, and the front doorbell rings and the maid goes to the door and looks and sees who's there and calls up to her mistress and says, "The grandchildren are here." This is December of 2010. And the grandmother calls down, "Lock the door." Okay, let's talk about another phenomenon which is relevant here. In 1980, the disparity between the highest paid executive in an American corporation, looking at the 365 largest companies, the disparity between that top executive and the standard worker was 42 to 1. Today, that ratio exceeds 500 to 1. I love the cartoon where the politician is standing where I am giving a speech about the millions of jobs he's created, and the picture shows the waiter in the back of the room leaning over to one of the patrons saying, "Yes, that's right, and I've got 3 of them." The disparity in wealth and savings are even more disturbing than the income figures. In the post-World War I year, there was really widely shared prosperity. Income for all quintiles doubled from 1947 to 1979. That's all of the quintiles in the economic scheme. Now the wealth owned by that top, and in that time the wealth actually dipped in the top quintile. Today, the wealthiest 1% of our people own 38% of all private wealth. Between 1983 and 1998, almost all of the growth in wealth went to the top 20% of households. In the same period, the wealth at the bottom 40% showed an absolute decline. We're not talking relative, we're talking about an absolute dollar decline in the lower 2 quintiles. These are not good figures, and they lead to, it seems to me, a couple of consequences. The first is that we seem to be re-entering the world which existed at the time the estate tax was adopted back in 1916. This is a tax that's almost 100 years old now, folks. Theodore Roosevelt said at the time that we need an estate tax. We need an estate tax so that those fortunes swollen beyond all healthy limits will be diminished. The country has a long and standing apprehension of large fortunes. Louis Brandeis, before he was on the Supreme Court, made the statement that we can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we really can't have both. Indeed, wealth is power. There could be no clearer demonstration of that axiom than the political history of the move to repeal the estate tax. These folks have been able to adroitly bring about a public attitude by the campaign which they have run. Now, I want to put in a parenthetical remark here. You know, I disagree and I demean what these folks have done, but they're not bad people. I mean, they're playing the American game. This is the way we do things in this country, and I don't think I'm anxious to change that. I mean, that's okay. But the fact of the matter is that we need to very much to bring some sense of good sense and rationality to our processes, and it is unfortunate that really kind of a myth can be changed into reality by the efforts of some very, very wealthy people. One of the illustrations of this is the senator walking through the airport in Chicago, and the baggage handler comes over and looks at him and says, "Senator, way to go, Senator, we're going to get rid of that doggone death tax." The second implication of this huge concentration of wealth is this, and that is that as a result of that, we're on the threshold of what will be the largest transfer of personal net worth in the history of the Republic. The studies which are accepted by everybody who observes this sort of thing show that over the next 50 years there will be a minimum of $41 trillion moved from one generation to the next. Now, I've gotten so I can sort of get my mind around the difference between a million and a billion. I can't handle a trillion. I don't know how to think about that. But that's not so important as the subsidiary fact that over that period of time, the next 50 years, the average collection from the estate tax would be a minimum of $152 billion and could range as high as $600 or $700 billion, depending on how the economy goes. But let's just take the minimum. At that number, what could you do? Reinstate the GI Bill? Pay half of the Social Security shortfall? Do something about this year's $400 billion deficit? What does this country, what kind of recklessness is at large that we would, in the face of a war and huge demands, healthcare, one thing or another, and a $400 billion deficit coming down the road, how could we go about repealing this tax in the midst of that? It's reckless. It's plain and simple recklessness. Okay, so let's talk about the morals of this thing. Somebody down here who's well known, I don't know who it is, and if I did I wouldn't say, but it doesn't really matter. Somebody has said, I don't need Bill Gates to tell me about our country's principles. I know about the estate tax, and I know that I have a right to pass my wealth to my children. So, what are our country's principles about that sort of thing? What is right and proper? How many of you think, and don't show your hands necessarily, but how many think that the idea of being able to give your $50 million to your 3 kids is really important? That is really great for this country that you'd be able to do that. Give me a break. That's not what we want to do. I really like thinking about a situation where, let's go out to 2009 when the exemption becomes $3.5 million and the rate is 45%. And if I had my way, I'd say, let's just lock it up right there. That's not a bad scenario. It's a good landing spot. So somebody has $10 million, not a bad number. And incidentally, A family with 3.5 million each, 3.5 for the husband, 3.5 for the wife, $7 million. I mean, that's a lot of money. It's not what it used to be, but it gets us away from taxing just ordinary rich folks who have a house that's increased in value and who got lucky in the market or whatever. And it makes sense to me to have an exemption at that level. And, and that's at a level that nobody ever dreamed about before, because just a couple of years ago it was $675,000. But let's look at this case. Let's look at our $10 million couple. They get a $7 million deduction, pay taxes on $3 million at the rate of 45%, and the net result is a tax on their net worth of about 13%. And their kids get $8.5 million, plus a little. Well, let's move on up. Let's talk about the 50 millionaire. What is a 50 millionaire like? 50 millionaire is very likely a person who has a summer cottage somewhere, maybe a condominium on an island somewhere, and does a lot of flying in private airplanes. So, how important is it to preserve that for his and her kids? I don't think it's important at all. What is the arithmetic here? $50 million, take away the 7 exemption, you got 43, tax it at 45%, you end up with a tax something under $20 million and a rate of about 38% effective rate. That doesn't seem confiscatory to me. But let me tell you what I really think. I think my 2 hypothetical families owe it to the United States. Warren Buffett says it better than anybody. He says, look, I have some skills, as a result of which I have become very wealthy. But let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I wouldn't be worth a dime if I'd been born in East Peru. What I am is a function of where I was born. And where was he born? He was born in a place that has an army and a navy, sure. It has peace and order by and large, sure. But beyond those givens of public infrastructure, we have a justice system that works. We have a market that works beautifully. Some economists would say that the ability to buy and sell freely and confidently adds 30% to the value of everything in the place. So why aren't people rich in this country? People are rich in this country because they are smart, because they worked hard, because they had a little luck, and because they live in a place that makes it possible. The thing I like to cite in this argument is the role of the United States in the economy. We spend something in excess of $90 billion a year on research in this country. Research through our universities and our laboratories. Research that creates things like the internet, integrated circuits, human genome. Economists are clear about the fact that over the last 50 years, at least a half of the growth of our economy is a function of changing technology. Who is the greatest venture capitalist in the history of the planet? His name is Uncle Sam. Who would invest in creating integrated circuits? Who would invest in understanding the human genome? Which there doesn't seem to be any question that's going to completely change the facts about health in our country and around the world. Who would imagine putting up the money to create the internet? Nobody. That's what venturing, and that's what makes our economy so dynamic. And I'm just not talking about somebody who had the good luck to start a software company in the midst of all this. I'm talking about people who have a partnership interest in a downtown building, or own a farm, or an array of corner grocery stores. It's the economy that makes it possible for people to get into the taxable categories I'm hypothesizing. Think about this one with me for a minute. Just imagine, if you will, that we have all been invited up into heaven to witness God's work for a day. And we're sitting over there in the corner of her office. And she has this idea, because it's obvious that she's perplexed and has been kind of fussing. But, kind of the light goes on, and she calls her assistant and says, I want to talk to the two spirits next to be born in the world. Please bring them in here. So here the two spirits come before her desk, and she says, yes, you may not be aware that the heavenly treasury is in a fair amount of trouble, too many investments in the dot-coms, and I need to build that back up. And of course, I am a long-range thinker, so I've got this idea for replenishing the treasury here, and it goes like this. I know that one of the two of you is going to be born in the United States, and the other one I don't know. I really don't know where you're going to be born. But knowing that I have one spot in the United States, I'm just going to auction it off to you two guys. And I just want you to take this piece of paper, each of you, and you come back in tomorrow morning and hand it in. I want you to write on there the percentage of your net worth that you're willing to leave to my treasury on the date of your death. What percentage will you give up to be assured this birth spot in the United States? So, my question is simple. What is it worth to be an American? What's it worth to be an Oregonian? A little death tax is not a bad thing. Thank you.
Tippy toes again. A benefit of being a City Club member is the privilege of asking questions of our speakers. The first question today is from our board host seated at the head table, Kurt Wabring, who's chair of the research board and a consultant with the firm of Sextant Consultants. Following Kurt's question, we're open to questions from City Club members. Please line up behind the microphone so that we have time to ask as many questions as possible. Identify yourself as a City Club member and keep your question, please, to 30 seconds. Mr. Gates has to leave promptly after this, so he has, as I mentioned earlier, kindly signed a number of the books rather than sit for signing individually. So I hope all of you will consider buying one of the books. And now Kurt's question.
I have at least 5 questions. One of which is where does your ethics come from? But I want to ask you particularly about foundations. You're on the board or founder of a foundation, and I'm wondering. And we know that foundations do wonderful work throughout this country and the world, and in Oregon. Oregon Community Foundation, and others. So I'm wondering if the estate tax were to change, what you think the impact might be on giving by individuals towards and creation of foundations.
I will duck the first non-question there, Kurt. Where do people get their ethics? It's a vast array of input from your family, from your church, your school, from the friends you have. I don't think there's any. As people say, how come your son's so generous? I don't know why he's so generous. I'm glad he is. There's a lot of discussion about the relationship between charitable giving and the estate tax. And there is heavy argument on both sides of that. And the bottom line fact of it is that nobody really knows unless we did it, and then we'd see what happened afterward. Most of the studies, and the most recent one, which I think is the most careful of all, done by the Brookings people, argue very strongly that that the repeal of the tax will have a significant diminishing effect on charitable giving. Think about it yourselves and ask yourself this question. So, my husband and I have got $10 million, and under present circumstances, let's go ahead to 2009, we're going to have a $1.5 million estate tax to pay, something of that kind. Now, that's one scenario where we preserve the estate tax, and you're asking, and somebody says to you, your lawyer is pretty well, by the way, do you have any interest in making any charitable bequests? For each dollar you give to your church or college, it'll take 50 cents off of your estate tax obligation. And so, that's pretty good to get the government to pay half of the gift, basically, 45%. I've been there, done that, had that conversation, and frequently generated a response, well, we should do something like that. Now, the other scenario is the estate tax is gone and you've got $10 million and you're talking to a lawyer, and he or she doesn't say anything about this because he or she has no obligation to say anything, wouldn't be inclined to say anything to you about making a charitable gift. There's no reason to. So, the ordinary couple, how many charitable gifts are you going to make? You've got some more money going to your children, and if your sense is, well, I'm not sure it's so smart to give them all that money, maybe I should give something to the alma mater or something of that kind. I don't know. My own judgment is that the first scenario is more apt to produce charitable giving than the second. But that's a very long-winded answer, Kurt. But in my opinion, the repeal of the estate tax will diminish charitable giving.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Mr. Gates, thanks for the wonderful work you're doing. You talked about the effectiveness of the specious arguments of the other side in this issue. There's a couple arguments I've been playing with that I'd like to know whether you think they're worth incorporating in our wrap. One thing is that Republicans always argue that if you tax something, you get less of it. So I wonder if we should start arguing that a high enough death tax is the key to immortality. And second, we became the greatest economic power on earth with an estate tax. Franklin Roosevelt instituted a 91% top marginal rate, and we had a 28-year economic boom. Bill Clinton raised taxes on rich folks, and we had an 8-year economic boom. Should we start arguing that the real key to economic growth is taxing the heck out of rich folks, whichever way possible?
Well, I'm no economist. I don't know the whys and whys, but your facts are certainly true. In the midst of a fairly aggressive estate tax and much more aggressive income taxes than what any of us are going to pay this year, we had some wonderful economic results. One really wonders about this thing called economic stimulation. But anyway, I will say this, that any notion anybody has that repealing the estate tax is an economic stimulant is pure, unadulterated hogwash.
Chuck Sheketoff, City Club member and Executive Director of the Oregon Center for Public Policy. Could you explain to this audience what you think is the reason why Senator Ron Wyden has repeatedly voted to repeal the estate tax? And then also I'd like to follow up to the first question you were asked, if you could talk about whether you think that members of boards of directors of nonprofit institutions, educational institutions, and the like that are reliant upon the estate tax to encourage charitable donations have an ethical or fiduciary duty to work to preserve the estate tax.
Okay, let me go into those backwards. Given the somewhat ambiguous answer I gave to the charitable giving issue, I'm not sure you could turn that into an ethical obligation, to be quite honest with you. It's a dilemma for people because to some extent most of those organizations are supported by very well-to-do people, and the assumption is that it's in their interest that the estate tax go away. So it gets awkward if you're on a board that takes a position that we're going to keep the estate tax around, and then your major donor is angry because you've taken a political position which is contrary to what he thinks is the right, he or she thinks is the right position. And so it's not simple. I exult in a couple of experiences I have had where this thing came under discussion at a philanthropic organization board, and the members of the board said, to heck with it. We really feel like we want the estate tax to stay there, that it helps us, and that's the position we're going to take. But there is some ambiguity. I think actually the independent sector is sort of the mastermind of all this, has come out on the side of opposing repeal. As to Senator Wyden, who was a very interesting guy, you know all that, you all know that better than I, but the only time I talked to him, he was completely hung up on the family business thing. And he's been approached by a number of constituents who have that situation and who are complaining bitterly about the risk to being able to maintain the business in the family when they have a liquidity problem of paying the estate tax. And somehow, I don't understand how he reconciles that with his voting against the reforms in the estate tax, which would liberalize the payment of estate tax on family businesses. That doesn't come through to me, but in any event, that's the best I know about what his thinking is. I have little doubt that if he thought about 30% of the people who live in this state felt otherwise, he might feel otherwise about it as well. Chuck's having, I need to say something about this whole situation. You need to know that there is in your fine state an organization called Responsible Wealth, and it has a group of very active people, many of whom are here at the Citizens for Saving the Estate Tax, and my being here is to a large extent a function of their very, very enlightened activity. So there are folks here who are working on this problem. Yes?
Hello, Heather Komet, City Club member. As a tax attorney, I've had the good fortune or malfortune, however you want to look at it, of speaking with a number of members in the Senate Finance Committee staff. And when you get away from talking about the repeal and you start talking about the estate tax credit, usually they start squabbling about numbers. Where should that number be? Where should that credit level be set? And as I'm sure you're aware, with the planning strategies available, a $10 million estate, not even taking into account any charitable giving, could easily be diminished to a $7 million level by any lawyer worth their salt without much difficulty. So when you spoke about the $3.5 million, if you could please expand upon how you think that might look in a growing economy as opposed to a shrinking economy, and if you think there should be any policy tie-in in conjunction and with full knowledge of these wonderful strategies that are available.
Okay, well, I certainly agree with people who think that our tax system should be calibrated to the cost of living. When you're talking numbers at this magnitude, my own sense of it is that it ought to be some sort of a step system where, as the cost of living generates a sufficient change in the number to equate to, let's say, $250,000, then it moves. You don't move it from 3.5 million to 3.506254, because people, we shouldn't have to deal with numbers like that when we're doing our tax returns. But
That's an accountant's problem, not mine.
well, so I do believe in indexing, and completely appropriate. Heaven knows we're coming to the day when indexing produces a contrary result. Seems to me be one of the possibilities that exists out there. So the other, I'm not sure I understand the other question. Try me again on the 3 million and 10 million thing.
I guess what I'm saying is because of valuation discounts that are available that nobody seems to be talking about. I mean, people are always talking about an exemption level set at a certain amount when in fact you're really talking about an estate much larger.
Okay. Well, this gets back to a couple of things which are said in this debate. One is that, on the one hand, people with enough money can go find a lawyer or an accountant and avoid paying the tax anyway. And that's just nonsense. That is not true. If it were true, that lawyer would have all the business. and you all know a lawyer. Now, there is no lawyer who can avoid the estate tax. Sure, you can avoid it by giving it all away to charity, and that is one of the rules. An intriguing rule, by the way. An intriguing thing that in our country there is a significant public policy that says that there is equal value to the country in money going to 501c3 organizations as there is in giving it than it going to the United States government. And that's rather an interesting proposition. And that the notion, of course, is that on the whole, whether it's the Junior Achievement or the University of Oregon or the Lutheran Church, that you put it all together and society gets a benefit equivalent to if it were going to tax dollars. And I think that's an interesting thing. I happen to be one who believes that maybe that's a little on the liberal side, to be quite honest. I kind of think that something of everybody's estate ought to go back to the United States and to the state. Okay, it is true that particularly with the family business, there are some what seem sophisticated, but which to an experienced estate planning lawyer are child's play to minimize the value of a family business on an estate tax return. I mean, there are rules like the discount for minority ownership, which is a gigantic benefit, and you can without any difficulty structure the ownership of a family business in a way that everybody has a minority interest, nobody has a majority interest, and you can generate, I mean, there's a family in Seattle that I went and talked to about this one time. They said, gee, this thing is so terrible, and that's why we're against it. They've been quoted in the paper and all that sort of thing. So I got the numbers from them and sent it off to one of the people I know in New York who happens to agree with me on this issue. And he said, no problem. You know, that family's problems could be dealt with in such a simple, straightforward way. So it is certainly true that the family business problem is enormously exaggerated. It is enormously exaggerated. I mean, there's something like 0.4% of all the returns had some kind of a closely held business in them. So, you know, just in terms of numbers, it's just a teeny tiny little thing. So anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Daniel Hyken, City Club member. At the very beginning of your talk, you said that a person's attitude towards taxes says it all about their philosophy and worldview. What do you think the effort to get this repealed says about the worldview of the people that are behind this?
It says that they have what I'm afraid is the majority view. Well, they have the attitude which is generated and reinforced by the emphasis on private property and the inviolability of what's mine, and that is a part of the American ethic. There is no question about that, and that's why the man says, I don't need Mr. Gates to tell me what ethics should be. I'm going to give my money to my kids. So I think that I think plainly that what it says that they are really into that. And it also says that they've got it wrong. Thank you, Daniel.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Gates, my chosen area of expertise is alternative transportation. But today, I have a general question, a generally important question, that if I may, I would ask of you. What is, in your view, the purpose of government?
Okay. Well, in a way, government is a supplier. Government is a supplier like Walmart and your dentist. It supplies services to people, and they pay for it through taxes. Grossly oversimplified, and so what are those services? Well, to start with, of course, it's the Army and the Navy. But as you get on into it a little bit more, where else do you go to buy public education? There isn't any argument about that, really. I understand about charter schools and private schools and this sort of thing. That's all fine, but that's a fringe thing. We're never going to educate the children of this country any way except through public education. So the government is a supplier of a service. This is a fine crowd, Susan. There are more things if you want me to enumerate them, but anyway.
No, I just wanted to make one point. I think the government has the responsibility to do what there is no profit in doing.
Okay, that is absolutely true. I mean, anyway, the dilemma is, just to carry that idea a little bit further, that unfortunately, and I suspect you're under this malaise here as well as we are just north of you, that there's this distrust. What did a friend of mine call it? This corrosive, a corrosive mistrust of public life, of public servants, and that sort of thing. And it's undoubtedly true that government is less efficient than Walmart, and it may be even true there's some people who are skimming and who are venal, but that's such a small part of the thing, and I don't give that away, and I don't for a minute think we ought to just tolerate it. But the fact of the matter is that, well, I've already said it. Where else are you going to buy public education except from the government? And what we should be doing, of course, is being as careful as we can about the kind of people we elect. As a matter of fact, this is super idealism, but as if it were true that we showed some respect for those people, we'd have better people.
Mark Magnuson, City Club member. I was at a social event last week and mentioned I was going to come listen to you give this talk. And among the folks I was standing with, I got very strong emotional reactions about this subject. And everyone was on the side of repealing the tax. I wonder if you got any advice on how we could quickly turn folks' attitudes around in a conversation. Is there any story, anecdote, fact? How do you change that attitude?
Well, you know, the quickest thing, it seems to me, having been there, is the last part of what I talked about. The question of rich people's indebtedness to their country. And that we're just collecting. We're not social engineering. We're bill collectors. This is something that you owe. But you know, another answer may be to walk away quietly and don't get all riled up, because you know those are really tough conversations. I do have another thought, though. It's not a quickie, but tell them to buy the book.
Thanks for what you're doing. Ken Lewis, City Club.
Yes, Ken.
It seems to me that if the estate tax is repealed, everybody else's taxes will be increased to pay off what needs to be paid. Now, if that's true, and this is very special interest legislation then, the repeal of the estate tax, and it applies to 3,000 people a year, there can't be many people in a state like New Mexico where Domenici is a senator, or in one of the Dakotas where Conrad Burns is a senator, who are all for the repeal of the estate tax. What is being done to let the people in those states know that the senators in those states are advocating the most special interest legislation that could possibly occur, applying in those states to maybe 5 or 10 people?
Yeah. Well,
don't we need a campaign beyond what you're doing, which is really wonderful, but don't we need a campaign to counteract those who are saying get rid of the death tax?
yeah, we do, and you know, I'm just an amateur politician. This is not a big movement that we've got going here.
But you need to start one.
Well, okay.
If you and Warren
How
Buffett...
much time have you spent raising money in your life, Ken?
A lot.
Give me a break.
A lot. But if you and Warren Buffett and others like that take the positions you do, then obviously the movement is there. Bobby Kennedy didn't enter the race, and the movement was there, and Gene McCarthy entered the race instead. The movement is there, but somebody has to lead it.
Well, no argument. No argument. You know, and the answer is that this may be very unfair to Mr. Domenici, but there are very large contributors to his campaign who are telling him to repeal the estate tax.
But there are many more in the state who vote for him not knowing that he was for the repeal of the estate tax.
Well, that may be true, but it gets back...
That's true of Ron Wyden, too. Most Oregonians don't know that he's for the repeal.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Money talks.
Yes.
We're down to 1 minute, so if we got one quick question and a half a minute answer.
That will be hard.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you, Susan. I'm Clark Balcom, City Club member. It seems to me that nothing can be understood well in isolation, only by comparison, and I've always had good success in speaking to people, comparing the guy who earns his living and pays income tax with the guy who inherits money, and if this bill goes through, would pay nothing, and the inherent unfairness of that. And it seems that people throughout the economic spectrum can understand it when looking at it that way.
Well, right. The reaction is
I had a
not
longer question,
universal.
but
Yeah, that's right. Well, somebody would say you're encouraging class warfare, to which Warren Buffett, God bless him, says, yeah, and my class is winning.
I think Mr. Gates has the hearts and minds of the City Club, and I'd like to offer him an honorary membership. City Club is adjourned.